Okay, so on to environment texturing. And the most important thing when it comes to texturing large landscapes is paying attention to the reference, but also knowing what should be a texture and what should be a scatter. And this, of course, comes down to how close we get to any given object, but also experience. The more you get used to building these landscapes, the more you will understand what you can get away with in terms of texture versus scattering. So just before we start, let's take a look at the lights that I have set up, just so you can see the settings here, in case you want to copy them. And on the out node, I have this set to color space ROP in the color management. And I have also enabled the diffuse albedo AOV. Okay, so let's jump into the texturing and we'll drop down a new shader. Call this something like mountain. And I'll make sure to assign this new shader. And drop down and use standard surface. Cool. I'll set this roughness to 1 and the base to 1. And just to start simple, let's bring in a tailable texture map. All the maps that I am using are from textures.com, so they are all free. And I'll make sure to set this to sRGB texture. And I will tile this by 50. Now, instead of adding this in to the next parameter here, I'll just copy and paste relative references so I don't have to change them both. And navigate to this nature moss. So this is from textures.com. Nice. So I'll just hit render again. Okay, so this is fine, although it doesn't match the reference that I'm going for, which is this image here. So I want the landscape to be a little more yellow, and then we have these rocks poking through. So let me just add down a new color correct. And change some of these settings. I'll lift the gamma and the exposure. And shift the hue so it's more red. And increase the saturation. So I'm looking for something that's about 0.2. This is fine. On the luminance, I'm pressing I to use the pixel sample. Cool. So let's start bringing in those masks that we created previously. I'll use the user RGB to bring in the sediment. And I'll just use this color correct to mix between a darker value and the value that we have as the base. So let me just plug this in here. I'll zero out all of these parameters and plug in the sediment. So what I want to do with this is to add some darker runs down the middle of the mountain. And these will follow where the rivers would be. Now, I don't want rivers, but what this does is it adds little darker patches where water would have built up and it would have become a little muddier or more damp. Cool. The next one is the grass noise mask. Move this out of the way. And I'll just copy and paste everything we have here. And switch this to grass noise. And this just adds some dark patches to break up the monotony of the texture. The other one I have is the dirt mask, and this will add some dirt around the riverbed here. So I'll just copy and paste this again and bring in dirt mask. And these were, of course, all created when we were building this height field. And use a mix. So this time I'm bringing in a texture. Again, it will be from textures.com, so it's free. And this one, yep. And this one is called Mud Washed. Now I know it will be too dark for me, so I'll just drop down another color correct and brighten this up. Still a little too dark. This is fine. And finally, I want to do the same, but bring in the bedrock. Let me just navigate to the texture. And this textures.com Cliffrock 3 is again free, but I have went ahead and added some white spots on top to add a little bit more. And of course, we need to mask this by the bedrock. Nice, so this gives us our base masks. Let's add some bump on top of this. And I'll just take this guy here and use this as the bump. To use the bump, we need to add down a bump to the node. And we plug this in to the normal. Now I do have a height map for this moss, so let's grab that. And I'll increase the bump so we can see it a bit better. The other thing I want to do is to make sure that these relate to each other. I will channel reference this scale into the scale on this map here. And that keeps it all consistent. Okay. Cool, so this adds a lot of nice information to the landscape, but what we're really missing here is, of course, the displacement. So let me just start adding this in. I will again copy and paste this guy, as this is the height of the rocks, and I will make sure to channel reference these ones into these ones. And I'll plug this in here. I will also bring in this height that we have here. because I want to use this on the grass using a mix. The grass will be the black and the rock will be the white. And I'll just again use the bedrock mask. So one thing to bear in mind is at the moment, this whole landscape for me is about 1 million polygons. So I have space to add some subdivision levels on top of this. It may be that yours is too heavy, and in which case I would split the geometry from foreground to background and give some more geometry to the foreground objects and less as you go back in distance. It also matters where the sun is hitting. If anything is in shadow, you might be able to give that a little bit less geometry too. So to activate the subdivision, we go to the Arnold tab and switch this on. I want 2 subdivision levels. And on the displacement, I just want to switch on auto bump. So any of the information that we can't get from the amount of polygons that we create will be added on top as a bump. Okay, so let me just check a couple things. I'll make sure that this is set to the height map of the cliff rock. And yeah, I'll hit render. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on your RAM at this stage to make sure that it doesn't get too high. Arnold does show the RAM usage up here, but it disappears at the end of the render, unlike Mantra. Okay, so we have some displacement coming through, but it's a little light. We have a couple of ways to add the height. We can do it on the top level, but that does apply to everything. But I only want to apply this to the bedrock, so I'll add a multiplier here and crank this up. I'm also not a fan of the color, so let's just check this out and make sure it's correct. It's a little bright for me. Let's just darken this down. Ah, the gamma was on. Okay, so I'll turn this off. And looking at the diffuse albedo, I kind of want to rotate this so it's coming down more like this. So to do that, I can use a UV translate node or a UV transform node. And I'll set this to about something like this. This is the way I had it set up previously. Of course, I will need to make sure I also do this on the displacement, and I will channel reference this guy into this one. Okay, hit render again. Okay, let me just make sure this is set to raw rather than texture. And I can probably increase this some more. And bring in some yellow to the rock as it's a little grey. So let me just add a range which is similar to the fit range within the VOP section, and I'll just reduce this, which will just bring a little bit more of the texture of the grass onto the rock. And I'll enable smooth step just to make sure that it is smooth on the transition. Okay, now this is better. I'm getting some more information. I think that two things. It's probably a little dark on the rock, contrary to what I did previously. I'm breaking this up. And I also want to reduce the displacement a little bit on this guy. So I can multiply this down. And also reduce the bump. So it's worth mentioning here that because we are adding displacement, we are technically moving the geometry away from its original position. Now, if we were scattering on top of this, we might find that we have floating points. So what we need to do is to counteract this by dropping down a subtract. The easiest way to check this is just to disconnect the displacement and hit render and see what it looks like without any. And take a screen grab of this. And then we can compare this to the displacement and then subtract any values to get it back to where it needs to be. Awesome. So another thing I wanted to quickly mention is, again, if you're finding it a little slow, to optimize the geometry a little more, you could go ahead and delete what you don't see within the frame. The easiest way to do that is just to select all of this geometry and perhaps grow the selection a little bit using Shift G, and then invert the selection and then delete. And this way you only get the geometry that you see within the camera. I have already done this, but I did this for a moving camera. So let's see what the render looks like now we have added this subtract and how far we are away from this geometry. Okay, so if I flip back and forth, we've taken it down a little too much. So let me just bring it back up. Okay, so this is pretty bang on, and I'm happy with this. And this is a really good base to go ahead and start scattering. Thanks.